Remember the theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and charity. So the greater virtue is to practice charity, which is actually to be an absolute pacifist. They don't say you're practicing charity when you're at war. Totally different than Augustine. They say that doesn't make any sense. You're not practicing charity. You're killing the guy. You're protecting yourself and your people, and you're fighting for your country. You're bringing justice to the enemy. You're not bringing love to the enemy. So anyway, that's the greater good, but that can't always be practiced. Okay, but that's what
never define charity as going belly up.
Yeah.
I mean, why would you ever not defend your home and let the enemy come in and get your children? I mean, at the very least, that's sort of that's the reductio ad absurdum that we get to. Would you actually not defend your home and your children against an intruder? So, I mean, why is charity defined as that?
Theology.
Right. But when you're talking about protecting your home and your family,
why is that not extended to a society?
Okay.
Fairly. Why is that not considered a fair extension, a logical extension?
The just warrior would say it has to be. It is actually, you have to defend society because, God put you in a society to defend that society. In fact, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they would go so far as to say, it doesn't matter what country you're in, you have to defend that country. The Eastern Orthodox Church looks to modern Russian literature as one of its 6 sources of authority for just war. Or, excuse me, for the Justifiable war tradition.
Now those books, the references,
yes.
Tolstoy and...
Yes, and get this, okay, this is really interesting. I didn't intend to get to modern literature, but now it's not on par with Scripture or with the patristic writings, of course, but it's still an influence that can be considered. Can't remember his name, and I'll pronounce it wrong anyway. Solzhenitsyn, maybe?
Solzhenitsyn.
Okay. He wrote a book called August 1914, I want to say. Okay. In that book, there's a soldier named Sonia. Have some of y'all read it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I haven't. Oh my goodness, now I'm really out of my league.
Yeah.
But correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a really interesting story. In the book, does anybody remember why Sonia chose to fight for Russia? Do you remember what he said? He said, I feel sorry for Russia. So that there's this idea. No, but he had this sense of almost resignation, but still duty, because this is my country,
But and that's the justifiable.
Right. It's the whole mindset is you kind of have to you're looking through a prism that's just changed a little bit.
So as long as you have the right motives in your heart, it's okay to exercise the justifiable option.
For the individual soldier. And of course at the country level, at the level of the state, it has to be, there are 3 things that really you can glean from the just war tradition, the justifiable war tradition. And that's proper authority, defense only, defense of the homeland, defense of the church, and making sure that you target the bad guys and not civilians.
But is that to impute human nature to governments? Is that to impute human nature to governments and allow governments to then have the reflection of man within them in their actions rather than pragmatism?
I think so if I'm following you. I want to make sure I understand what you're saying.
What I'm seeing here is that in the instance of Sonia, the Russian soldier, we're drawing the parallel where Sonia's approach justifies the justifiable war theory.
For the individual.
For the individual.
Right.
Now, do we extend that conclusion to governments and impute to governments those good characteristics of human nature, the natural law aspects of the things that man would naturally know are right and proper, even though you can go back and look at the very pragmatic aspects of government, and I'm thinking particularly of Metternich back in the early 1800s, where he was probably the most pragmatic of the folks, and did absolutely evil things because it was necessary and good from the perspective of politics at the time.
Right.
And I'm not sure that since government implements the supposed thoughts of its citizens, yet it sometimes does so in a pragmatic rather than in a humanly inspired fashion. By human I mean natural law inspired fashion.
Right.
Does not that argument fall apart at that point?
Well, to some extent, I see what you're saying.
I'm just having a hard time with this justifiable war theory. I think it's a sellout.
Well, okay. There still are criteria. I want to make that clear, and there still are criteria. They're a lot more restrictive. Okay.
Would you repeat those again? Because you
Yeah,
just went
yeah,
through
I
the
just
criteria, and I
flew
kind
through
of.
some criteria
Yeah.
real
Are
fast,
those
almost
supposed-
parenthetically in the middle of a long rambling sentence,
Okay.
which is much of what I said. Yes, there are some criteria, and again, these are not spelled out anywhere. These are you have to pick them up through the sources. One is a legitimate political authority. Now that sounds very similar. In fact, that is almost exactly what we say in the West. And the legitimate political authority must be, in this day and age, the state. Whatever the regime, totalitarian, democratic, aristocracy, it doesn't matter. It's the legitimate political authority. That's one. The other is it has to be in defense. In defense. Now, in the olden days, that would be in defense of the church. In the modern era, that would be in defense of your country. Okay. And the third is, now those are, what are those? Jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum, right? Jus ad bellum.
Yeah.
Jus in bellum, justice within war. This is the third thing. It has to be, you have to make sure that you are the careful surgeon and not the elephant, the bull in the china shop. All right.
Proportional to the threat.
Exactly, proportionality. Now, they don't like that word, by the way. Okay, but that's exactly what it is, proportionality. Because they prefer to say, well, what we mean is we don't target non-combatants. Well, okay, they don't like the idea of a balancing test, and I understand that. But there is a proportionality aspect in that. You have to be careful who you target, and you have to be precise.
You
Okay.
can't drop an atomic bomb on a cruise missile would work.
Right, exactly. And you can't use a bazooka when a shotgun would work, you know. And there are times when, but I think that's a better example. And so these are basically the criteria. Now, this is a lot more actually restrictive, I think, than the Western view, mainly because of the defensive aspect. But
Well, how far out do they take that?
yes, this is what I was going to say. What is meant by defensive? What happened on 9/11? And how do we defend ourselves? Does this mean that we have to stay inside the United States and hunker down and wait for the next attack and try to shoot them down before they hit our buildings? I don't think so.
Well, if we'd only found their plans, would we have been justified to go out and capture them in a
Right.
third country?
Right. That's a great question. That's a great question. I don't know. That's just something to think about. But I don't think that what they mean necessarily by that in this day and age is that you have to stay on your territory and you can't, under any circumstance, it becomes an offensive war by virtue of where you end up. Now, it can. Okay. It doesn't mean it
in
does
other
not.
words, if we occupied Afghanistan and Iraq and declared you're now the 51st and 52nd states of America,
Yeah.
Parentheses, so we can have your oil.
Hold on. Well, this is exactly the point. It has to be defensive. That means that you have to have enough information to know that this is you are fighting in defense of your country, and you absolutely have to go into another country because that is the only way to defend yourself. Okay. So anyway, I think, and again, this is not written down in the Eastern Orthodox View of Just War book that you can check out of the library. Okay. These are things that have been gleaned. I want to go on the 6 sources real quick because we're getting a little bit close on time, but we're doing all right. Okay, if you look at your outline, we've actually done pretty well here. We've talked about justifiable versus just, the lesser good, not an evil. Do the ends justify the means? Many in these Orthodox churches say absolutely, the ends justify the means, just like we talked about. Can you kill somebody? Well, it totally depends. That's the means, it depends on what the end is. Okay, now, that doesn't mean in every situation morally the end justifies the means. But when you're talking about war and killing, when you're talking about killing, it totally depends on what your end is. Okay, because the means are killing. All right, we've talked about the function of justice. This is good. Oh man, we are doing great. The civilizing ethic is those are the 4 cardinal virtues, and that's what we're practicing according to the Eastern Church when we fight in war. And I think, again, this is the big difference between the East and the West. We are Augustinians in the West. Many of us are, or many of our churches are, because we're the Western churches. In some way or shape or form. I'm not saying that our theology is Augustinian completely, but I am saying that we're influenced by him. In the West, some people many call him St. Augustine, some call him Brother Augustine, and that's not a compliment. All right, there's a little bit of irritation with St. Augustine in the East, and one of the many things is this idea that war is an act of love, because it just doesn't make sense to the East. And again, it's a practice of justice. They really bring in the cardinal and theological virtues, which I personally think is fascinating. It's a fascinating, different way to look at war than we have.